The courtroom camera captured the exact moment when everything changed. Karen Whitmore, dripping in Cartier diamonds and a Chanel suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, leaned forward in her chair and said the words that would destroy her life forever. "Listen, sweetheart, you're here to serve justice, which means you serve people like me. You're essentially just a civil servant." The pause that followed wasn't just silence. It was the kind of deadly quiet that happens right before a bomb explodes. Judge Judy Shinlin's eyes narrowed into slits of pure judicial fury. Her hands, which had been casually resting on her bench, slowly pressed flat against the wood. The audience members collectively held their breath, some covering their mouths in shock, others leaning forward to make sure they'd actually heard what they thought they heard. Had this privileged socialite really just called America's most feared TV judge a servant on national television in her own courtroom? But here's what makes this story absolutely insane. That insult, that single moment of breathtaking arrogance, was just the beginning. Because what Judge Judy did in the next 47 seconds would become the most viral courtroom moment in internet history, shared over 80 million times across every platform. We're talking about a complete and total destruction so brutal, so perfectly executed, that it would leave this entitled Karen sobbing and begging for mercy from the same judge she had just disrespected to her face. Before we dive into those devastating 47 seconds that changed everything, smash that like button right now if you're ready to see entitled arrogance meet unstoppable justice. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens when someone foolish enough to disrespect Judge Judy. Trust me, what you're about to witness will restore your faith in accountability and make you believe that karma is not only real, but it has perfect timing. Karen Whitmore wasn't in Judge Judy's courtroom by accident. This 48-year-old trust fund always, who had never worked a real day in her life, was suing her former personal assistant for $15,000 in damages to her luxury Mercedes. According to Karen's lawsuit, Maria Santos, her assistant of 3 years, had somehow damaged the vehicle's custom leather interior during what Karen called a fit of rage after being terminated for incompetence. But the truth was far more sinister, and Judge Judy had already figured it out before the hearing even began. Maria hadn't damaged any car. She hadn't been incompetent. She had simply asked for her final paycheck after Karen fired her without cause. And Karen, who had spent her entire privileged life using lawyers and lawsuits to bully people into submission, had decided to teach her former assistant a lesson about knowing your place in the social hierarchy. Karen sat in the plaintiff's chair like she was posing for a magazine photo shoot. Her $8,000 Hermes Birkin bag rested casually on the table in front of her, positioned just so to make sure the cameras caught the label. Her manicured fingers, adorned with rings that could have paid off Maria's student loans, drummed impatiently on the armrest. She'd already checked her phone twice during the opening proceedings, treating the entire courtroom like an inconvenient appointment she had to get through before her spa reservation. Judge Judy had watched this entrance with the calm patience of a predator studying prey. She'd seen entitled people before, thousands of them over her 25-year career. But Karen Whitmore was special. This wasn't just ordinary arrogance. This was generational wealth mixed with absolute contempt for anyone she considered beneath her station. And Judge Judy had already decided that this woman was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her privileged life. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had no idea they were about to witness television history. Production assistants made their final camera checks. The bailiff took his position, and Karen Whitmore sat there completely confident that her money, her lawyers, and her status would carry her to victory. She had no idea that the woman sitting behind that bench had spent the previous night researching every detail of Karen's life, uncovering secrets that would turn this simple small claims case into a criminal investigation. When Karen delivered that fatal insult, calling Judge Judy essentially a servant, The transformation in the courtroom was instantaneous. Judge Judy didn't yell or lecture. She simply leaned back in her chair, with a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The smile regular viewers knew meant someone was about to be absolutely annihilated. The 47-second countdown to Karen's destruction had officially begun, and nothing in her privileged life had prepared her for what was about to happen next. Karen Elizabeth Whitmore was born into the kind of wealth that most people only see in movies. Her grandfather had made his fortune in commercial real estate during the 1950s, building shopping centers across the American South. By the time Karen arrived in 1975, the family trust was worth over $40 million, and she had never, not for a single day of her 48 years, experienced what normal people call consequences. Growing up in the gated estates of Greenwich, Connecticut, Karen learned early that money wasn't just currency. It was power, immunity, and the ability to make problems disappear and people obey. Her childhood was filled with private schools where donations ensured perfect grades, country clubs where staff knew better than to refuse any request, and a social circle where everyone understood that the Whitmore name meant you didn't follow the same rules as ordinary people. By her 20s, Karen had perfected the art of wielding wealth like a weapon. She went through personal assistants the way most people go through coffee, firing them on whims, refusing to pay final wages, and burying them under expensive lawyers and frivolous lawsuits if they pushed back. It was a pattern she'd repeated so many times it had become muscle memory. Hire someone desperate enough to tolerate her abuse. Work them to exhaustion. Find some petty excuse to fire them without proper compensation. And, if they complained, sue them for more than they could afford to fight. What made Karen particularly dangerous was her complete lack of empathy, combined with an almost sociopathic understanding of how to exploit the legal system. She knew most service workers couldn't afford attorneys, that the threat of a lawsuit was often enough to make people walk away from wages they'd earned, and that her country club lawyers could drag cases out for years, bankrupting anyone who dared challenge her. She also knew that in her social circle, treating the help with casual cruelty wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Maria Santos had walked into Karen's employment 3 years earlier with hope and determination. A 29-year-old immigrant from the Philippines, Maria had worked her way through community college while supporting her younger siblings. The job as Karen's personal assistant seemed like an opportunity. Good pay, at least on paper, and a chance to learn how wealthy families operated, maybe even network her way into a better career. Instead, Maria found herself trapped in a nightmare of entitlement and abuse. Karen's idea of a personal assistant was somewhere between a servant and a slave. Maria was expected to be available 24/7, responding to texts at 3 a.m. about trivial matters like which shoes Karen should wear to brunch. She was required to run personal errands that had nothing to do with her job description. Picking up dry cleaning, walking Karen's dogs, even cleaning Karen's home when the regular housekeeper was off. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Maria politely asked for her paycheck, which was already 2 weeks late. Karen looked at her with genuine confusion, as if the concept of paying staff on time was some bizarre foreign custom she'd never encountered. "You'll get it when I feel like writing the check," Karen said dismissively, not even looking up from her phone. "If you don't like it, there are 1,000 other girls who'd kill for your job." Maria made the fatal mistake of standing her ground. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have rent due. You agreed to pay me bi-weekly. I need my paycheck today." The words were polite, professional, and reasonable, but to Karen, they represented the worst possible offense. A staff member, someone she considered beneath her, was making demands, acting like an equal, forgetting her place. Karen's response was swift and vicious. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Clean out your things and get out of my house." When Maria asked for her final paycheck and the 2 weeks of back wages, Karen's eyes went cold. "You'll get nothing. In fact, I'm going to make sure you regret ever speaking to me that way." 3 days later, Maria received notice that she was being sued for $15,000. The lawsuit claimed that during her employment, Maria had damaged the custom leather interior of Karen's Mercedes S-Class in an act of malicious destruction committed during a fit of rage upon termination. The claim was completely fabricated. Maria had never even driven the Mercedes, but Karen knew exactly what she was doing. The lawsuit wasn't about recovering damages. It was about punishment. It was about teaching Maria, and anyone else who might hear about the case, that you don't challenge Karen Whitmore and walk away unscathed. What Karen didn't know was that Maria Santos wasn't like the dozen other assistants she'd destroyed over the years. Maria had kept meticulous records of her employment. Text messages showing Karen's abuse, emails documenting the late payments, even recordings of their conversations made legally in a one-party consent state. And Maria had done something that terrified people like Karen. She'd fought back. Unable to afford a private attorney, Maria represented herself in the preliminary hearings, presenting her evidence with quiet dignity. Her documentation was so thorough that the case was escalated beyond small claims court. That's when something remarkable happened. Judge Judy's producers, always looking for cases that showcased injustice and entitled behavior, discovered Maria's story. They reached out, offering to hear the case on national television. For Karen, appearing on Judge Judy seemed like a joke, almost beneath her. But her lawyer explained that it would resolve the case quickly, and Karen was supremely confident that her polished appearance and expensive legal representation would win over a TV judge who probably didn't understand how people of her caliber operated. She had no idea that Judge Judy had handled thousands of cases involving wealthy people who thought their money made them special. And she definitely didn't know that Judge Judy had already uncovered information about Karen's past that would turn this case from a simple employment dispute into something much darker and more serious. Karen Whitmore had built her entire life on the belief that wealth equals immunity, that servants exist to serve, and that people like her don't face real consequences. She'd successfully bullied, sued, and intimidated her way through 48 years without ever being held accountable. But she'd made one critical miscalculation. She assumed Judge Judy's courtroom operated like every other space in her privileged life. She was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. Judge Judy Sheindlin didn't become America's most feared TV judge by accident. Before her television career began, she had already built a legendary reputation that made seasoned attorneys nervous and entitled litigants regret their life choices. 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan had transformed her into something people like Karen couldn't comprehend. Someone completely immune to wealth, status, and intimidation. Her courtroom in New York City had been a proving ground where she'd handled over 20,000 cases involving every type of human dysfunction imaginable. Wealthy parents trying to buy custody, trust fund kids thinking money made them untouchable, entitled spouses believing social status entitled them to special treatment. Judge Judy had seen them all and developed an almost supernatural ability to spot liars, manipulators, and sociopaths within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. What made Judge Judy particularly lethal to people like Karen was her absolute indifference to money and status. She'd grown up in Brooklyn, the daughter of a dentist, and worked her way through law school when women attorneys were still rare. She'd prosecuted cases in family court, where she saw real victims, real suffering, real injustice. A Chanel suit and a Hermes bag didn't impress her. They disgusted her when worn by people who used wealth as a weapon against those who couldn't fight back. Her preparation style was legendary among legal professionals. While other TV judges might skim case files, Judge Judy treated every case like a criminal investigation. She read every document, researched every background, made phone calls to verify stories. Her production team knew that when Judge Judy requested a deep background check, someone was about to have their entire life exposed on national television. For the Karen Whitmore case, Judge Judy had gone even deeper than usual. Something about the lawsuit had triggered her instincts. A wealthy woman suing her former assistant for car damage, but refusing to provide proper documentation. It smelled like the cases she'd seen hundreds of times before. Rich people weaponizing the legal system against workers who couldn't afford to fight back. Her research team uncovered a pattern that was absolutely damning. Karen Whitmore had been involved in 23 similar disputes over the past 15 years. Former employees, assistants, contractors, and service workers who had either been sued or threatened with lawsuits after requesting payment for their work. Most had settled quietly, unable to afford the legal battle. A few had simply walked away from wages they'd earned, too intimidated to fight back. But Judge Judy had found something even more explosive, something that transformed this from a simple employment dispute into potential criminal fraud. And she'd been sitting on that information, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate it in Karen's face. As Karen Whitmore strutted into her courtroom that morning, dripping in designer labels and radiating contempt, Judge Judy had watched with the calm patience of a predator who had already won. She knew exactly how this case would end. She knew what evidence would destroy Karen's lawsuit. And she knew that the woman sitting in her courtroom about to call her a servant had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been carefully set just for her. The bailiff's voice cut through the courtroom chatter. All rise for the Honorable Judge Judith Schindlin. Everyone stood immediately, showing the respect that came automatically in Judge Judy's domain. Everyone except Karen Whitmore, who took her time gathering her designer bag, checking her reflection in a compact mirror, and finally rising with the casual indifference of someone who believed courtroom protocol was optional for people of her status. Judge Judy noticed. She noticed everything, but she said nothing, simply taking her seat and gesturing for everyone else to do the same. Her eyes locked onto Karen with the intensity of a laser sight, cataloging every detail of the performance about to unfold. Karen smoothed her Chanel jacket, crossed her legs with practiced elegance, and prepared to deliver what she clearly believed would be a masterclass in sophisticated testimony. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Judy began, her voice carrying its signature no-nonsense authority. "You're suing your former assistant, Maria Santos, for $15,000 in damages to your vehicle. Tell me what happened." It was a simple question, one Judge Judy had asked thousands of times before, but Karen's response immediately revealed exactly what kind of person she was dealing with. Karen didn't just answer the question, she launched into a theatrical performance that would have been rejected by a soap opera for being too over the top. "Your Honor," she began, emphasizing the title with just enough condescension to suggest she was humoring a process she found tedious. "This is really quite simple. I employed Miss Santos as my personal assistant, a position of significant trust and responsibility in my household." The way Karen said my household dripped with casual superiority, as if she were describing a small kingdom rather than a suburban Connecticut estate. Unfortunately, Miss Santos proved to be completely incompetent at even the most basic tasks. She was constantly late, frequently made errors, and showed a shocking lack of respect for my time and property. Judge Judy's eyebrow raised slightly. The first warning sign experienced viewers recognized immediately. But Karen, completely oblivious to the danger, plowed forward with increasing confidence. When I finally had no choice but to terminate her employment, she became absolutely hysterical. She began screaming at me, making threats, and stormed out of my home in what I can only describe as a rage. Maria Santos sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her face showing the kind of dignified restraint that came from years of enduring Karen's abuse. She didn't interrupt, roll her eyes, or show the anger that would have been completely justified. She simply waited her turn to speak, something Karen had never learned to do in her entire privileged life. "The next day," Karen continued, building to what she clearly believed was her devastating conclusion. I discovered that the custom leather interior of my Mercedes had been deliberately damaged, scratched, torn, completely ruined. $15,000 in repairs. It was obviously done by Miss Santos as revenge for being fired for her incompetence. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly. Ms. Whitmore, do you have photographs of this damage? Repair estimates? Any documentation of when this alleged vandalism occurred? The questions were straightforward and reasonable, the kind of basic evidentiary request any competent litigant would anticipate. Karen waved her hand dismissively, as if documentation was something only common people needed to worry about. My attorney has submitted some paperwork. But really, Your Honor, my word should be sufficient. I'm a respected member of my community. I have absolutely no reason to lie about something like this. The courtroom went quiet. Even Karen's attorney, a tired-looking man in an expensive suit who had clearly learned not to argue with his wealthy clients, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Judy's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. Your word should be sufficient, she repeated slowly, letting each word hang in the air like an accusation. Before Karen could respond, Judge Judy turned her attention to Maria. Miss Santos, tell me your version of events. Her voice, which had been sharp with Karen, softened slightly when addressing the defendant. Maria took a breath and began speaking in a quiet but steady voice. Your Honor, I worked for Mrs. Whitmore for 3 years. I was never late. I have text messages showing I responded to her requests at all hours, even in the middle of the night. I never damaged her car. I never even drove her car. She fired me because I asked for my paycheck, which was already 2 weeks late. When I requested my final wages, she told me I would get nothing, and that she would make me regret asking. As Maria spoke, her voice began to crack with emotion. I have a family to support. I worked 60, sometimes 70 hours a week for her. I did everything she asked, even things that weren't in my job description. And when I simply asked to be paid for my work, she destroyed my life with this lawsuit. Karen actually rolled her eyes, a gesture so blatant and disrespectful that several audience members gasped audibly. Oh, please, Karen muttered loud enough for the courtroom microphones to pick up. The victim card. How predictable. Judge Judy's gaze snapped back to Karen with the speed of a striking snake. Excuse me, Miss Whitmore, did you just mock this woman's testimony in my courtroom? The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Karen's attorney actually put his head in his hands, recognizing that his client had just made a catastrophic mistake. But Karen, incredibly, doubled down on her disrespect. She let out an exaggerated sigh and said, Your Honor, I'm simply trying to move this along. We both have better things to do than listen to sob stories from disgruntled employees who don't understand that actions have consequences. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, that dangerous smile playing at her lips. Actions have consequences, she repeated softly. That's very interesting, Ms. Whitmore. Let's explore that concept further, shall we? Karen, still completely misreading the room, smiled back. She thought she'd just scored a point. She had no idea she'd just handed Judge Judy the perfect opening to begin her systematic destruction. Judge Judy's next question came with surgical precision. Miss Whitmore, in your 3 years of employing Miss Santos, how did you treat her? The question seemed innocent enough, almost conversational, but it was a trap, carefully set, and waiting to be sprung. Karen answered without hesitation, without any awareness of how her words would sound to everyone listening. I treated her exactly as one should treat staff, firmly, with clear expectations. People in service positions need structure and boundaries, or they start thinking they're equals. The courtroom went silent. Even Karen's attorney closed his eyes, knowing what was coming. Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice dangerously quiet. Equals. You don't see Miss Santos as your equal. Karen actually laughed, A sound so casually cruel it made several audience members visibly recoil. Equal? Your Honor, let's be realistic. She was my assistant. That's like asking if I see my housekeeper as equal or my gardener or any of the help. They provide services. I pay for those services. That's the extent of the relationship. Judge Judy's fingers drummed once on her bench, a gesture her regular viewers knew meant volcanic rage was building beneath her controlled exterior. So in your worldview, people who work service jobs are beneath you? Less than you? Not less than, Karen said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to a child. Just different. There are people who lead and people who serve. That's how society functions. Surely you understand that, Your Honor. The setup was perfect. Judge Judy had guided Karen exactly where she wanted her. Help me understand your philosophy, Miss Whitmore. You believe some people exist to serve others? Karen nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the danger. Exactly. Finally, someone gets it. Look, I don't make the rules of society. I just understand them better than most. People need to know their place. Service workers serve. That's literally in the job title. Judge Judy's voice remained calm, almost academic. And what's my role in this courtroom, Miss Whitmore? Karen smiled, thinking she was about to deliver a clever observation. Well, you're here to serve justice, obviously. Which means you serve people who come to your court seeking resolution. You're a civil servant, technically. It's right there in the title. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Karen continued, oblivious to the horror spreading across every face in the courtroom. I mean, let's be honest, Your Honor. We're not that different from each other. You serve the public. Maria served me. It's all the same concept, really. We all have our roles. Then came the moment that would be replayed millions of times. Karen leaned back, completely comfortable, and delivered the final insult with a condescending smile. At the end of the day, sweetheart, you're here to serve justice, which means you serve people like me who actually matter. You're essentially just a civil servant. A well-paid one, I'm sure, but still fundamentally in a service position. The courtroom exploded in gasps. Maria's hand flew to her mouth. Karen's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. But Judge Judy didn't react with anger. Instead, she did something far more terrifying. She smiled, that cold, calculated smile that meant someone had just signed their own death warrant. A servant, Judge Judy said softly, testing the word. You called me a servant? Karen incredibly nodded. I mean, technically, yes. It's not an insult. It's just accurate. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, folding her hands with deliberate calm. Miss Whitmore, thank you for that clarification. I think it's time we had a very educational conversation about service, respect, and consequences. Her eyes locked onto Karen with predatory intensity. And I have exactly 47 seconds of information that's going to change your entire life. The countdown had begun. Judge Judy's voice dropped to that terrifyingly calm tone that had made grown attorneys weep on national television. Ms. Whitmore, since you believe in people knowing their place, let me educate you about yours. She reached for a thick folder that had been sitting on her bench throughout the entire hearing. The one Karen had barely noticed. The one that contained the research that would destroy her life. Let's start with your car damage claim. You say Miss Santos destroyed the interior of your Mercedes S-Class on the day you fired her, correct? Karen nodded, her confidence still intact, but starting to show microscopic cracks. Yes, that's exactly what happened. Judge Judy opened the folder with deliberate slowness. Interesting, because according to Connecticut DMV records, you sold that specific Mercedes 3 months before you fired Miss Santos. The car you're claiming was damaged didn't even belong to you when this alleged vandalism occurred. The color drained from Karen's face. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. There must be some mistake. I have multiple cars. Maybe I mixed up the dates. There's no mistake. Judge Judy cut her off with razor precision. The repair estimate you submitted is for a completely different vehicle that you purchased 2 weeks ago. You fabricated this entire claim. Karen's attorney was frantically flipping through his papers, clearly seeing this information for the first time. Judge Judy wasn't finished. Not even close. But here's what makes your case truly fascinating, Miss Whitmore. This isn't the first time you've pulled this scam. She pulled out a document and held it up for the cameras. 23 times. 23 former employees over 15 years. You have a pattern of firing workers when they request their wages, then suing them for fabricated damages to force them into silence. You've collected over $200,000 in fraudulent settlements from people too poor to fight back. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Karen tried to stand, her voice rising in panic. That's not… You can't just… Those were legitimate. But Judge Judy's voice cut through her protests like a chainsaw through butter. Sit down, Miss Whitmore. I'm not done educating you about your place. Karen collapsed back into her chair, her Chanel suit suddenly looking like a costume, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the terror spreading across her face. Judge Judy continued with merciless precision. Do you trust your family? The one you've been living off your entire life? I had my team look into that too. Turns out you've been claiming poverty exemptions on property taxes while simultaneously listing luxury assets for insurance purposes. That's called tax fraud, Ms. Whitmore. The IRS tends to take that very seriously. Karen's hands were shaking now, her fingers clutching the edge of the table for support. Her attorney had gone pale, realizing he'd been complicit in representing someone whose criminal activity went far beyond a simple civil dispute. Here's my ruling, Judge Judy declared, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You will pay Miss Santos $15,000. Not for car damage that never happened, but for the wages you stole, the emotional distress you caused, and the legal fees you forced her to incur with your fraudulent lawsuit. Karen tried to speak, but Judge Judy raised a hand, silencing her instantly. I'm not finished. I'm forwarding copies of all this evidence to the Connecticut State Attorney General's office for criminal investigation into fraud, tax evasion, and systematic exploitation of workers. I'm also sending copies to the IRS. The 47 seconds were up. Judge Judy had systematically dismantled Karen's case, exposed her criminal pattern, and triggered investigations that would haunt her for years, all with the surgical precision of someone who had been destroying entitled liars for decades. Karen Whitmore had walked into that courtroom calling Judge Judy a servant. She was about to leave it as a criminal defendant facing federal charges, and the transformation from arrogance to devastation was about to reach its spectacular conclusion. Before we see Karen's complete meltdown, smash that like button if you think Judge Judy just delivered the most savage takedown in courtroom history. Drop a comment saying, "Justice served," if you believe Karen got exactly what she deserved. And hit subscribe because what happens in the next chapter will show you why you never, ever disrespect Judge Judy. Karen's world was collapsing in real time, and the cameras were capturing every second of her destruction. The transformation in Karen Whitmore happened so fast, it was almost surreal. The confident socialite who had strutted into the courtroom draped in designer labels was gone, replaced by a trembling, desperate woman whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time on national television. "Wait," Karen stammered, her voice cracking as she half rose from her chair. "Wait, Your Honor, please. This is all a misunderstanding. I can explain everything." Her hands reached out toward Judge Judy in a gesture of pleading that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. Judge Judy's response was colder than a winter morgue. "Explain. You want to explain how you accidentally filed 23 fraudulent lawsuits? How you accidentally committed tax fraud? How do you accidentally call me a servant in my own courtroom?" Each question landed like a physical blow. Karen's perfectly styled hair was coming undone as she ran shaking hands through it repeatedly. The diamond rings that had been positioned so carefully for the cameras now seemed like evidence of the wealth she'd accumulated through exploitation. "I didn't mean the servant thing. That came out wrong. I was just trying to make a point. Please, Your Honor, I have so much respect for you. Respect? Judge Judy's laugh was utterly devoid of humor. You showed me exactly how much respect you have. You treated this courtroom like your country club. You treated Miss Santos like your property. And you treated justice like something you could buy with your family's money. The tears started then, genuine and unstoppable. Karen's makeup began running in dark streaks down her cheeks as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a tsunami. "Please," she sobbed, her voice now completely stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Please don't do this. I'll pay Maria whatever she wants. I'll drop the lawsuit. Just please don't send those files to the Attorney General." The desperation in her voice was absolute. This was the same woman who had laughed at Maria's testimony 20 minutes earlier, now reduced to begging for mercy from both the judge she'd insulted and the assistant she'd tried to destroy. Judge Judy watched this meltdown with detached professional interest. "Ms. Whitmore, you had every opportunity to treat people with dignity. You had every chance to pay your employees fairly. You chose cruelty. You chose exploitation. You chose to use the legal system as a weapon against people who couldn't defend themselves." Karen was openly weeping now, her sobs echoing through the silent courtroom. Her attorney sat frozen, knowing there was nothing he could say or do to salvage this disaster. The audience watched with a mixture of satisfaction and shock, witnessing the complete destruction of someone who had believed herself untouchable. "The judgment stands," Judge Judy declared with finality. $15,000 to Miss Santos. Case dismissed. The gavel came down with the sound of a cell door slamming shut. Karen collapsed forward onto the table, her body shaking with sobs. The bailiff approached to escort her out, but she could barely stand. The woman who had called Judge Judy a servant was now being physically supported as she stumbled toward the exit, her cries of, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," trailing behind her like ghosts. Maria Santos sat quietly, tears of relief streaming down her face. 3 years of abuse, months of legal harassment, and countless sleepless nights had finally resulted in justice. Judge Judy nodded at her with something that might have been respect, a silent acknowledgement between two women who understood that sometimes the law actually works the way it's supposed to. Within 2 hours of the episode airing, Karen Whitmore's courtroom destruction had become the most viral video on the internet. The clip of her calling Judge Judy a servant, followed by her complete emotional breakdown, spread across Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube like wildfire. By midnight, it had been viewed over 15 million times. By the end of the week, that number had exploded to over 80 million views across all platforms. The hashtag #TheKarenServantMoment trended worldwide for 3 consecutive days. Social media users created memes, reaction videos, and compilations of Karen's facial expressions as her world collapsed. The moment when she confidently said, "You're essentially just a civil servant," became the most replayed 5 seconds of courtroom television in history. Her transition from smug arrogance to sobbing desperation was analyzed, dissected, and celebrated by millions who had their own stories of dealing with entitled employers and abusive bosses. But the consequences for Karen Whitmore went far beyond internet infamy. Her lifestyle brand, Whitmore Refined Living, which sold overpriced home goods and etiquette courses to wealthy suburban women, imploded within 48 hours. Major retailers dropped her product line. Her book deal for Grace Under Pressure, A Modern Woman's Guide to Elegance, was canceled. Sponsors fled so fast they left scorch marks. The Connecticut State Attorney General's office moved with surprising speed. Within a week, Karen was formally charged with 15 counts of fraud, 8 counts of tax evasion, and multiple counts of filing false legal claims. The evidence Judge Judy had compiled became the foundation of a criminal case that prosecutors called one of the most clear-cut examples of systematic exploitation they'd ever seen. the IRS audit. That followed was equally devastating. Karen's claims of poverty exemptions while maintaining luxury assets resulted in criminal tax charges and a demand for over $400,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Her family trust, which she'd relied on her entire life, was frozen pending resolution of the criminal charges. Perhaps most dramatically, 12 of Karen's 23 previous victims came forward after seeing the Judge Judy episode. They formed a class action lawsuit seeking to recover the money Karen had extorted from them through fraudulent legal claims. Their combined lawsuit sought over $300,000 in damages, and with Judge Judy's research as evidence, their case was ironclad. Karen's social circle, the country club friends who had enabled and encouraged her entitled behavior for decades, abandoned her with remarkable speed. Women who had laughed at her stories of putting staff in their place suddenly claimed they'd always found her behavior troubling. The country club quietly revoked her membership. Former friends deleted photos with her from social media and issued public statements distancing themselves from her actions. Maria Santos, meanwhile, became an unexpected advocate for workers' rights. She was invited to speak at labor organization events, appeared on news programs discussing employer abuse, and eventually started a nonprofit called the Dignity Project that provided legal resources to service workers facing exploitation from wealthy employers. Her GoFundMe started to help with legal fees, raised over $200,000 from supporters inspired by her courage. Judge Judy's handling of the case became legendary in legal circles. Law professors used the footage to teach students about the importance of thorough case preparation and the dangers of allowing wealth to influence legal proceedings. The episode was analyzed in legal journals, discussed in courtroom ethics courses, and held up as an example of how justice should work when judges refuse to be intimidated by money or status. 6 months after her humiliation on national television, Karen Whitmore's life bore no resemblance to the privileged existence she'd enjoyed before calling Judge Judy a servant. She'd sold her Connecticut estate to pay legal fees. Her Mercedes collection was liquidated to cover restitution payments. She was facing a potential 10-year prison sentence if convicted on all charges. The woman who had spent 48 years believing wealth made her immune to consequences had learned the hardest lesson of her life. The cultural impact of Karen's destruction extended far beyond her personal downfall. The case sparked national conversations about wealth inequality, the exploitation of service workers, and the ways wealthy people weaponize the legal system against those who can't afford to fight back. News outlets ran investigative pieces about similar patterns of abuse. Several states introduced legislation to penalize employers who file fraudulent lawsuits against workers requesting legally owed wages. Support groups formed online where former personal assistants, housekeepers, and service workers shared their own stories of abuse from wealthy employers. The solidarity and validation these workers found in each other's experiences led to increased reporting of labor violations and a measurable uptick in workers standing up for their rights. Judge Judy herself addressed the case in a later interview, saying simply, "Respect isn't about money or status. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person you encounter." Karen Whitmore learned that lesson the hard way, and I have zero sympathy for her situation. She created it herself through years of cruelty and exploitation. The episode became Judge Judy's most watched of all time, introducing a new generation to her brand of no-nonsense justice. Viewership for her show increased by 30% in the months following the Karen Whitmore case as audiences craved more examples of entitled people facing real consequences. For Maria Santos, the vindication was profound but bittersweet. "I didn't want to become famous," she said in an interview 6 months later. "I just wanted to be paid for my work and treated like a human being. But if my experience helps even one person stand up to an abusive employer, then everything I went through was worth it." The lesson from Karen Whitmore's spectacular downfall was crystal clear. Respect isn't optional. Consequences are real, and calling Judge Judy a servant is possibly the worst decision anyone can make on national television. Karen had spent her entire life believing that wealth and status put her above accountability. In 47 devastating seconds, Judge Judy had proven that belief catastrophically wrong. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with the precision of a master and the impact of a meteor. Karen Whitmore will spend the rest of her life knowing that the moment she called Judge Judy a servant was the moment her entire world came crashing down.